Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today we are presenting our subject in a slightly different format than usual. Instead of working through one continuous list, we are presenting two separate lists involving presidential cabinets. First, we will examine the worst cabinets in American history, those damaged by corruption, scandal, instability, abuse of power, or serious dysfunction. Then we will consider the cabinets containing the largest number of questionable, unqualified, poorly suited, or incompetent appointments. Those two lists are not necessarily the same, we discovered.
We did. And our discussion, ladies and gentlemen, will be different as well. For each cabinet, one of us will present the case for including it. The other two will respond with questions, objections, qualifications, or alternative facts. This is important because calling an entire cabinet bad could be misleading. Some administrations combine excellent public officials with astonishingly corrupt or incompetent ones.
We also need to distinguish among three things here. A person can be inexperienced without being incompetent. A person can be highly qualified on paper and still make disastrous decisions. And a cabinet can contain individually capable people who become ineffective because of infighting, presidential interference, personal rivalries, or divided loyalties.
These rankings are judgments. They're not scientific measurements. We are evaluating the first Trump administration from 2017 through 2021. We are not giving a final historical ranking to President Trump's second cabinet because it is still serving as we record this episode in 2026. So let's begin with our first list, which is the worst cabinets in American history. Start us off with.
Now, I will begin with Nixon's administration. Nixon belongs on this list because Watergate involved people at the highest levels of his government. The most important cabinet connection was former Attorney General John Mitchell. Mitchell left the Justice Department to lead Nixon's reelection campaign. He approved the operation that led to the break-in and wiretapping attempts at Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex. In 1975, Mitchell was convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury for his role in the Watergate cover-up. He served time in federal prison. The scandal also exposed a wider culture in which political loyalty, campaign operations, presidential power, and law enforcement responsibilities became dangerously entangled.
We have to ask a very important question. But does that make Nixon's entire cabinet one of the worst? Mitchell was no longer Attorney General when the Watergate break-in occurred. Much of the criminal activity came from the White House staff and Nixon's reelection committee, not from the cabinet as a collective institution.
Dr. Dineen, that is the strongest argument against including it here. Watergate was primarily a presidential, White House, and campaign scandal. It would be inaccurate to suggest that every cabinet secretary was participating in this.
Yeah, we should also remember that some senior officials resisted Nixon during the Saturday Night Massacre, quote unquote. Attorney General Elliot Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus refused Nixon's order to fire the Watergate special prosecutor. Both resigned rather than carry out an order they believed threatened the rule of law.
So Nixon's cabinet enters as a special case. It contained a former Attorney General who became a convicted Watergate conspirator, but it also contained people who forcefully resisted presidential misconduct. That is why Nixon is listed fifth rather than first. Now let's look at number 4. Andrew Jackson's first cabinet was not among the most corrupt, but it may have been one of the most personally dysfunctional. The crisis was known as the Eaton Affair, also called the Petticoat Affair. Secretary of War John Eaton had married Margaret Eaton, a much younger woman, whose personal life was a subject of gossip in Washington. Several cabinet members' wives refused to socialize with her. Jackson took this treatment personally. He saw attacks against Margaret Eaton as similar to the attacks once directed against his late wife, Rachel. The dispute soon became entangled with the political rivalry between Vice President John C. Calhoun and Jackson's political heir, Secretary of State Martin Van Buren. By 1831, the conflict had become so disruptive that both Eaton and Van Buren resigned. Their resignations gave Jackson the opportunity to demand the resignation of most of the remaining cabinet and start all over again.
Yeah, but should a social dispute really place a cabinet among the worst in American history? No one was stealing oil reserves or accepting kickbacks, by the
Well,
way.
Dr. Weaver, the scandal itself may sound trivial, but the consequences were not. Cabinet members stopped functioning as a cooperative advisory group. Their families wouldn't socialize, political factions hardened. Jackson's relationship with Calhoun, his own vice president, collapsed. The cabinet had to almost be completely reconstructed, and this was at a time of the nullification crisis, which almost led to secession in the 1830s.
Exactly, Dr. Dineen. So this is a cabinet made ineffective by personalities rather than lack of intelligence. The members were not necessarily unqualified. They simply just became unable or unwilling to work together.
Yeah, you're right, Chandler. Jackson's first cabinet earns a place on the worst list because it disintegrated as a working institution. It was government by personal loyalty, resentment, gossip, and faction. My goodness. Let's turn to DJT, Donald Trump. The first Trump cabinet belongs on this list because of its extraordinary turnover, ethics controversies, unstable leadership, and prolonged use of acting officials. Very important. Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price resigned following controversy over his use of costly charter and military flights. A later Inspector General review found repeated violations of travel requirements and substantial waste. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt resigned while multiple questions concerning travel, security expenses, housing arrangements, and ethics were under investigation. Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke also left amidst investigations. A later Interior Department Inspector General report concluded that Zinke and his former chief of staff had failed to meet their duty of candor when speaking with investigators. The cabinet also experienced unusually frequent departures and replacements. Brookings found that turnover in Trump's senior leadership exceeded that of recent administrations, with many positions undergoing repeated changes.
But turnover alone does not prove incompetence. Some secretaries resigned because they disagreed with the president. Others were dismissed, even though they possessed substantial qualifications. Defense Secretary James Mattis, Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and later Attorney General William Barr all entered office with significant government and military experience.
That's very true. High turnover can indicate poor appointments, but it can also indicate a president who demands personal loyalty, changes his mind frequently, or removes experienced officials who resist him. Some of the instability may therefore reflect Trump's management style more than the abilities of the cabinet members themselves.
But that still affects the historical evaluation of the cabinet. A cabinet is supposed to provide continuity, expertise, supervision, and honest advice. Constant dismissals, resignations, vacancies, and acting appointments make those functions harder.
Then the fairest conclusion here is that Trump's first cabinet was not uniformly incompetent. It was unusually unstable, unevenly qualified, and frequently surrounded by controversy.
Now let's go on to number two. Ulysses S. Grant was personally admired for his military leadership and his role in preserving the Union. However, he was often a poor judge of political associates. Grant appointed friends, loyalists, and personal acquaintances, then sometimes defended them long after evidence of misconduct appeared. Secretary of War William Belknap was involved in a kickback arrangement connected with military trading posts in the West. When a House investigation closed in, Belknap rushed to the White House and resigned shortly before the House voted to impeach him. The House proceeded with the impeachment anyway. The Senate's historical account describes the evidence as corruption that was blatant even by the standards of Grant's scandal damaged administration. Interior Secretary Columbus Delano resigned amid accusations of corruption and serious mismanagement within his department. Attorney General George H. Williams faced allegations that Justice Department resources were being used improperly. His reputation deteriorated so badly that he withdrew after Grant nominated him to become Chief Justice of the United States.
Yeah, Grant's private secretary, Orville Babcock, was also implicated in the whiskey ring, although Babcock was not technically a cabinet member. That distinction does matter. The whiskey ring involved distillers and government officials conspiring to avoid federal liquor taxes. That was a very important and large business thing. Hundreds of people were indicted.
But Grant also appointed Hamilton Fish as Secretary of State. Fish is generally regarded as one of the more capable 19th century secretaries of state. He helped settle disputes with Britain. He brought professionalism and stability to foreign affairs. Doesn't that prevent us from calling Grant's entire cabinet incompetent?
Yes, Chandler, Grant's cabinets were not uniformly bad. The problem was the repeated pattern: questionable appointments, weak supervision, corruption, personal loyalty that went on too long, and a president all too reluctant to believe damaging evidence about his friends. Grant himself was not shown to have personally profited from any of these scandals.
Yeah, I guess that distinction is essential. Grant's failing was less personal greed than misplaced trust and poor administrative judgment. But when a president repeatedly appoints people who abuse public office, the cabinet's failures become part of the president's responsibility. Let's take a look at Warren G. Harding. Our choice for the worst cabinet is Warren G. Harding. Now, Harding's cabinet was an extraordinary mixture of excellence and corruption. Interior Secretary Albert Fall secretly leased federal petroleum reserves at Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Elk Hills in California to private oil interests. Now, Fall accepted more than $300,000 in cash. That was a whole lot of money in today's money, a whole lot, cash, loans, and securities. He became the first former cabinet secretary sent to prison for misconduct committed in office. Attorney General Harry Dougherty, Harding's friend and political manager, became associated with influence peddling and corruption inside the Justice Department. Daugherty survived impeachment efforts and faced two criminal trials. Neither trial resulted in a conviction, that's true, but his leadership badly damaged confidence in the department. Veterans Bureau Director Charles Forbes, who was not a cabinet secretary, but he was another Harding appointee who abused his position. He was convicted and imprisoned after schemes involving veterans' hospitals, supplies, contracts, and government property, for goodness sakes.
However, it's important to remember Harding also selected several highly capable officials. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, for example, was a former governor, Supreme Court Justice, later Chief Justice, and a presidential nominee. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon became one of the most influential Treasury secretaries of the era, redesigning government policy in that frame. And Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover had an international reputation for humanitarian work and made the Commerce Department more active and more effective.
So Harding's cabinet was not the least qualified. It may have been the most uneven, a combination of some of the strongest and most dishonest appointments of the period.
Gosh, what a combination, right,
Yes,
Chandler?
sir. Yes, sir, Dr. Weaver.
Now, Harding's cabinet ranks first on the worst list, not because every member was incompetent, but because direct cabinet level bribery and corruption produced one of the greatest breaches of public trust in American history. Harding's inability to say no to dishonest friends helped create the conditions for it. Let's turn to our second list, the most unqualified or incompetent cabinets.
Let's do that. But before we begin that, Dr. Weaver, I just want to point out that we're going to change the standard for this second list. We're not asking only who was corrupt. We're asking which presidents made the largest number of appointments involving poor preparation, mismatched experience, weak judgment, favoritism, divided loyalty, or failure to perform during a crisis.
Now, we should be very cautious with the word unqualified, Chandler. Relevant experience is certainly valuable, but I want to make clear there is no single required career path for a cabinet secretary. A business executive may understand large organizations, a governor may understand administration, a military officer may understand national security, but the question is whether that background prepares the person for the specific department.
All right, well, let's get into our first pick here, Warren G. Harding. Now, he appears on this list too, but for a different reason. He did not appoint a cabinet filled entirely with amateurs. Hughes, Hoover, and Mellon had impressive qualifications. The incompetence came from Harding's inability to separate friendship from public responsibility. He knew that some members of his political circle had serious limitations, yet he still gave them access to federal power. Attorney General Daugherty was chosen largely because he was Harding's political manager and confidant. Albert Fall possessed government experience, but he used his cabinet position for personal enrichment. Charles Forbes received control over enormous Veterans Bureau resources and exploited that trust.
So, are they really examples of incompetence or simply dishonesty?
Well, in fact, Dr. Weaver, some were both. A dishonest official still may understand how an agency works, but Harding's incompetence was in the selection and supervision of people he should have never trusted with public resources.
That's why Harding is only fourth on this list. He chose several disastrous associates, no doubt, but he also chose some of the most qualified officials of the decade.
Yeah, let's turn to Ulysses S. Grant. Well, Grant ranks second because he repeatedly confused personal loyalty with qualification. His military career had taught him to trust subordinates, but political administration required a different kind of scrutiny. Belknap's kickback scheme, Delano's troubled Interior Department, and the allegations surrounding George Williams and the whiskey ring all revealed weaknesses in appointment, supervision, and accountability, too.
And again, Grant had some excellent officials. Hamilton Fish was highly capable. Treasury Secretary Benjamin Bristow aggressively investigated the whiskey ring, even though the investigation eventually came close to Grant's own circle.
That actually strengthens the point. Grant could identify talented people, but he did so inconsistently. He often gave too much protection to friends and associates while becoming suspicious of reformers who exposed wrongdoing.
Yet Grant was not personally proven to be corrupt, but the number of scandals suggests that he repeatedly failed to evaluate character, recognize conflicts of interest, and remove unsuitable officials promptly. That places his cabinet near the top of our incompetence list.
All right, now we're going to get into, and I want to make this clear, we're getting into Trump's first cabinet, not the second cabinet, too early to tell, but the first cabinet. This is the cabinet with the greatest number of members with limited direct experience. A Pew Research Center analysis found that it was one of the most heavily business oriented cabinets in American history. Before Trump's nominees, only 39 of 589, I want to say that again, 39 of 589 cabinet secretaries had entered office directly from business without any previous public sector experience. 5 of Trump's original nominees came entirely from business backgrounds without public office or senior military service. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos was a longtime advocate for charter schools, vouchers, and school choice, but she had never worked as a public school teacher or as an administrator. Republican Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski opposed her confirmation, citing her lack of experience with public education and gaps in her knowledge displayed during the confirmation process. Vice President Mike Pence had to cast a tie-breaking vote to confirm her. Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson was an accomplished neurosurgeon, but he had no professional background in housing policy, urban planning, public housing, or government administration.
Yeah, Carson's defenders argued that he'd grown up in Detroit, understood poverty personally, and had managed complex medical responsibilities. But personal experience with poverty is not the same as experience supervising a major federal housing agency.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had spent more than 4 decades at ExxonMobil and had extensive dealings with foreign governments. However, he became the first Secretary of State to enter office without previous military or government experience. His defenders saw an experienced international negotiator, but his critics saw a corporate executive facing an enormous diplomatic learning curve. Energy Secretary Rick Perry had served as governor of Texas, giving him substantial executive experience. But Perry had previously advocated eliminating the Department of Energy. During his confirmation process, he acknowledged that his earlier statements did not reflect the full appreciation of the department's work, including its major responsibility for the nuclear weapons complex.
But we must not pretend the entire cabinet lacked experience. James Mattis had a distinguished military career. Elaine Chao had previously served as Secretary of Labor. Jeff Sessions had served in the United States Senate and as Alabama's Attorney General. And William Barr had already been Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush. Several other members had served as governors, legislators, military officers, or senior officials.
Then why place Trump first?
Because the combination was unusual. Several secretaries entered departments with little direct subject matter experience. The administration experienced record setting turnover. Many positions remained vacant or were filled by acting officials. Some secretaries left amid ethical controversies, while others departed after conflict with the president. Lack of experience did not automatically produce failure, but it did increase the importance of stable staffing, expert advice, and institutional support. Those were precisely the areas in which the administration was frequently unstable.
I would phrase the conclusion carefully. Trump's first cabinet was probably the least conventionally qualified modern cabinet, but not necessarily the least intelligent. Business, military, medical, and political experience can all be valuable. The problem was the number of appointments in which the person's background had only a limited connection to the mission of their department.
Right on, Dr. Dineen.
Yes, I agree. All right. Our two lists reveal why these terms cannot be used interchangeably. The Harding cabinet was our choice for the worst, primarily because of direct corruption and bribery at the cabinet level. But it was not the least qualified. Hughes, Hoover, and Mellon were substantial figures.
Grant's cabinet suffered from repeated scandals and poor judgment in appointments, even though Grant had also selected excellent officials such as Hamilton Fish. Jackson's first cabinet was ruined by personal conflict rather than a general lack of experience. Nixon's cabinet was compromised by Watergate, but some cabinet and Justice Department officials resisted the president rather than assisting him.
Buchanan's cabinet was not included on our worst cabinet list. Its members were generally experienced, and the cabinet became more strongly unionist near the end. But several earlier members performed disastrously during the secession crisis and later served the Confederacy. That makes it a major example of incompetence, failed loyalty, and collapse during a national emergency.
And Trump's first cabinet ranks first for questionable or mismatched qualifications because several members entered major departments without any kind of conventional experience in those departments. The exceptionally high turnover rate made those weaknesses even more consequential.
The larger lesson, my friends, is that qualifications alone are not enough. A successful cabinet also requires judgment, honesty, cooperation, relevant knowledge, independence, and most importantly of all, a willingness to tell the president facts the president may not want to hear.
You are exactly right on that, Dr. Dineen. A cabinet of experts may still fail through corruption. A cabinet of outsiders can still succeed if its members learn quickly and respect professional advice. But a cabinet built around favoritism, personal loyalty, weak supervision, or contempt for expertise places both the president and the country at risk.
So, our final conclusions are these. Warren Harding had the cabinet most damaged by direct corruption. Grant repeatedly made poor appointments, and defended questionable associates. Andrew Jackson's first cabinet was one of the most personally dysfunctional. Nixon's administration was compromised by Watergate, although the formal cabinet was not uniformly involved. Buchanan's experienced cabinet failed catastrophically during the secession crisis. And Donald Trump's first cabinet contained the largest modern collection of officials whose experience did not match the departments they were selected to lead. Listen, I want to thank you for joining us for this slightly different edition of Things You Don't Know.
Yeah, guys, and we want to actually hear from you. Tell us which cabinet you believe belongs at the top or the bottom of either list.
And remember that the most famous cabinet scandal may not belong to the least qualified cabinet.
Yeah, please, please give us a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and return for more Things You Don't Know.